So Charles Swindoll tells the story of a bank that hired a man as its janitor. They closed early one day, and he was in a hurry to get home, just like the others were. So he quickly gathered up the trash. In this particular bank, all of the trash that was gathered up for the day was shredded. So he emptied what he believed to be the trash and sent it through the shredder. Just before finishing the last barrel, the closing cashier discovered that he had shredded all of the deposits for the day. Well, two things happened, and unfortunately you can probably guess the first one. And then after he was fired, they brought in a number of people early the next morning and seated them along a long set of tables. They tried to put together the shredded checks, attempting to match the tiny little pieces of signature, amounts of money, places, events, and so forth. It made the headlines of the news with three simple words: an impossible task. Those poor workers were to discover the truth that you could never put together thousands of checks that had been shredded, no matter how many people you hired to do the job. It turned out to be an impossible job. More on those lost checks later. In the meantime, I want to tell you about Catherine Scholes. She calls herself a wrongologist. A wrongologist. It's a made-up word, but I like it. She thinks and writes about the meaning of being wrong. Her book, Being Wrong: Adventures in the Margin of Error, is an interesting take on this facet of our humanity. And most of all, she does emphasize that it is a part of our humanity, of our being human. For other animals that are driven by instinct, the right action is simply the next action. There's not a whole lot of, room for thinking about right and wrong in terms of that. But humans are faced with choice. And a wide margin of the time, we choose wrong. As St. Augustine said, "Falor ergo sum." I err, therefore I am. I err, therefore I am. I'm not sure if that's profound agreement or profound disagreement, but I'm going to press forward with this sermon. But even though we all know that mistakes are human, that there's no way to escape making mistakes if we are human, that does not necessarily mean that we embrace doing so. Scholes compares mistake-making to a jack-in-the-box and also to death. Here's what she says: if fallibility is built into our name and our very nature, it is in much the same way that the puppet is built into the jack-in-the-box. In theory, wholly predictable; in practice, always a surprise. As with dying, we recognize erring as something that happens to everyone without feeling that it is plausible or desirable that it will happen to us. Catherine Scholes proceeds to divide error into two camps, what she calls epistemological error and moral error. Epistemological error is when we mistake something true for something false, or vice versa. And then moral error is when we commit a bad act or an evil act, when we do something that we shouldn't. But here, says Scholes, is the rub. It's actually quite hard to separate the two, to separate out epistemological error from moral error. Consider these examples. We wrongly assume that someone is stealing, and we call the police on them. We believe a stereotype about a person with a particular ethnicity. We are convinced that there are weapons of mass destruction in an unarmed country. Scholes says that reversing epistemological errors like these often involve changing moral course, which is gritty and difficult work. It's gritty and difficult work. And it's no wonder that there's lots of ways to evade responsibility for error. When I was studying Spanish, I was pleased to learn of a reflexive verb form that removes responsibility for an act. It's genius. We don't really have this in English, but I love it. It's the verb form say, which can be added to a sentence to sort of casually evade responsibility. So instead of saying, I lost the book, you can say, el libro se me perdió, which means the book got lost to me. It ingenuously disclaims responsibility as if a mysterious force, rather than our own carelessness, caused the loss of the item. Now, while we don't have anything as neatly grammatical as that in English, we do possess several turns of phrase that do equivalent work for us. There's the famous line employed by Nixon for Watergate, mistakes were made. You would do well to want to ask, yes, and by whom, right? And then there's my personal pet peeve, the I'm sorry if you felt that way. Sounds like an apology, but it actually lays the blame on the person making the accusation as if her feelings rather than the act were at fault. Now, there are few tools in our culture designed to do the opposite of this, to skillfully take responsibility for error. When I was living in Boston, I had a long drive to get to the church where I was doing my internship. Now, Boston is a famously Catholic town, and I'd often pass several parishes on the way to the Needham congregation. One time I was driving past a large Catholic church and happened to pass the side of it where it kept its dumpster. Now this, I kid you not. Right next to the trash were two large connected stalls. They were throwing out their confessional booth. They were throwing out their confessional booths. And as I passed it, I thought, if that isn't a great example of religion adapting to modern culture, then I don't know what is. Now, to be fair, I don't really know the whole story, and for all I know, they were replacing those booths with newer ones. That's probably the case. But it's still a good symbol, because it's true that fewer and fewer Catholics take advantage of that spiritual tool. The trash booth thus looks like a sign of the times. Now, confession is intended to bring people back into right relationship with one another before they re-enter community. Catholics offer confession before they take communion, the central ritual where people enter into the community of Christ. Confession allows them to get into right relationship with one another and with God. Now, while I know that there is a lot to be criticized about the guilt tripping that religion induces and the ways that confession has been misused, I think that there's something worthy in offering a mechanism that guides people through the difficult work of reconciliation and re-entering right relationship. To say, I was wrong and I want to do better. Now, Judaism has a similar mechanism, which happens on a yearly basis. On Yom Kippur, which is being celebrated this week, individuals atone for the sins of the past year, and they are expected to make teshuvah, repentance, seeking forgiveness and making amends for their past actions. Teshuvah is hard work. As Danya Ruttenberg puts it, and she's a rabbi, teshuvah demands specific steps. The bad actor must own the harm perpetrated, ideally publicly. Then they must do the hard internal work to become the kind of person who does not harm in this particular way, which is a massive undertaking, demanding tremendous introspection and confrontation with unpleasant aspects of the self. Then they must make restitution for the harm done, offering apology, and if confronted with the opportunity to commit a similar misdeed, must make a different and better choice in the future. It is only then, when that honest turning has happened in oneself, that one is ready for Yom Kippur and for entering a new year. Wow, hard stuff. No wonder the confessional is next to the dumpster. As Ruttenberg puts it, America is often perilously quick to welcome comebacks for people who have misconducted, in part because we do not know what it really means to atone. In other words, we have lost some of the tools that help us re-enter right relationship with one another. Both the givers and the receivers of harm are left to their own devices about how to deal with transgression. Or in American popular culture, we accept the appearance of reconciliation rather than require the more rigorous, authentic process for making amends. So we get avoidance rather than reckoning. I'm sorry if you felt that ways rather than genuine apology, and cheap comebacks rather than opportunities for restitution and forgiveness. Questions are left open like wounds. One of the reasons that this work is so hard is that it can feel impossible. It can feel so momentous, it's not even something that we feel we can approach. Once the damage is done, the depths of it become obscure to us, and we are left wondering when and how and if it is possible to reach out to another person to try to make things right. It's like the janitor who shredded the bank deposit slips for the day. The pieces left in their wake are voluminous, overwhelming, seemingly unmanageable. We say to ourselves, there is no way that I can piece all of that together. So what does it take? I think it takes trust. It takes trust in the process of reflecting on our error, admitting that we were wrong, and striving to come back into relationship. There are no guarantees about how this turns out, but in trusting the process, we just might discover that reconciliation is possible. One organization that has put a tremendous amount of thought and practice behind amends making is Alcoholics Anonymous. It sees amends making as a crucial part of its work, asking people to identify those that they have harmed and finding ways to make it right. I admire this about them because I think that they are one of the few groups in our contemporary society that creates a modern mechanism for accounting for past mistakes. They are also realistic about this. When I spoke with a friend of mine who is in the program, he said emphatically that there's no expectation that the other person will necessarily accept the apology. It is about attempting to clean up your side of the street, he said, and trusting that the other person will manage their side of the street when they are ready to do so. In a part of their literature, the organization tells a story of what this looks like. Here's what it says. While drinking, a man accepted a sum of money from a bitterly hated business rival, giving him no receipt for it. He subsequently denied having received the money and used the incident as a basis for discrediting the man. He thus used his own wrongdoing as a means for destroying the reputation of another person. In fact, his rival was ruined. He felt that he had done a wrong that he could not possibly make right. If he opened that old affair, he was afraid it would destroy the reputation of his partner, disgrace his family, and take away his means of livelihood. What right had he to involve those dependent upon him? How could he possibly make a public statement exonerating his rival? After consulting with his wife and partner, he came to the conclusion that it was better to take those risks than to stand guilty of such ruinous slander. He saw that he had to place the outcome in God's hands, or he would soon start drinking again, and all would be lost anyhow. So he attended church for the first time in many years, and after the sermon, he quietly got up and made an explanation. And just in case you're thinking of doing this, if you could let me know, like before, that'd be great. And in this instant, his action was met with widespread approval, and today he is one of the most trusted citizens in his town. And that all happened years ago. So ends the story. I admit that this story from the pages of Alcoholics Anonymous matches my own experience of owning mistakes and making amends. Not always. Sometimes the other person has not been ready to hear my apology. Maybe they never will be. But my attempts to come into right relationship have been less like fixing shredded banknotes and more like receiving bits of grace, often in places and times that I least expect them, even when I have erred, even when I was wrong. And that says to me that the mechanisms for making amends, for making things right, are not altogether lost to us. We may have left the confessional by the dumpster, or perhaps at the church that we came from. But I think that there's always an opportunity to reclaim these skills, to face our errors honestly, to try to make our relationships right again. My spiritual companions, the leaves are turning, the year is turning. We can turn too. Amen. I love you, and blessings on your journey.